Welcome to Calvary Campus Livestream. We're happy you're here. During this series, our building will become a classroom, and in this case, your living room too. We will be going through Mere Christianity, a book written by C.S. Lewis for both the believer and the skeptic. Join us as we take a philosophical approach to understanding basic Christian doctrine. And now, here's tonight's instructor, Mike Gaglione.
Well, everybody, hello, and welcome to night 5 of Mere Christianity, where we're going through C.S. Lewis's famous book. We are tackling section 4 tonight. And you may not know this, but this is now recorded because we had technical difficulties on our live stream, and so I figured, hey, I'm going to throw on this jacket because my whole shirt is like sweaty, and I'm just going to start from the beginning. We had about 20 minutes where we were strong, and I'm just going to do it over again, and the rest of it is going to be totally new stuff. So a couple things that I just want to basically, I guess a couple like housekeeping items. The first thing is I just want to say thank you, and I want to just really humbly say thank you. Thank you for joining in on the live stream, and thank you for reading the book. I think that this is the world where everybody just scrolls through Instagram, Facebook, watches Netflix, and it's like we're constantly entertained, and there are very few things that people do to grow themselves anymore. And I just want to say thank you because you're one of the people who's actually taken the time to grow yourself in the midst of the pandemic. And I hope that it's paid off for you. I hope that I've explained myself well. I do want to say this, and this isn't the carrot that I'm dangling. Well, maybe it is the carrot that I'm dangling at the end of the stick. I actually write thank you letters for everybody in tons of areas of my life. And so I wrote thank you letters for the people who have helped me in this. But I actually wrote a thank you letter to you guys. And so I'm going to share my thank you letter to you at the end, where there's a couple things that I want to say thank you for, and there's a couple things that I want to say to encourage you. But that'll come later, so you got to stay till the very end to get it. Or if you're just watching this recording, you can fast forward all the way to the end and read the letter. But anyway, that's just a couple housekeeping items. Thank you for joining in. I've got a letter for you. And then I guess I wanted to ask you, how's the quarantine going? I think that I'm as you can tell, I'm not I'm not on stage at ccdelco right now. I'm actually in my apartment in New York. Life has brought me back here, and so I'm going around trying to make it work, wearing a mask everywhere that I go. And that's life. The masks are hilarious. I was talking to one of my clients 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, and we were laughing because she was saying she was so grossed out. She was in the grocery store and somebody was wearing a mask, and the person literally was getting some cereal and had to sneeze, and so they took the mask off and sneezed and then put it back on their face and then proceeded to get their cereal and leave. And my client just stood there and was like, you've got to be kidding me. The whole point of wearing the mask is so that if you sneeze, it keeps all of that stuff in. So we were laughing about it, and then here I am, and I'm walking around the grocery store 2 days ago, and I've got my mask on, and all of a sudden I'm just minding my own business, doing my thing, and I feel that urge where you're I actually think I'm going to sneeze in a second, and my very first instinct was to go grab the mask, and I had pulled it kind of half off my face, and then I remember that story, and so I snapped it back, and I sneezed inside the mask, and all of that gross stuff just sat there, and I just had this moment where I was oh, get it off. This is disgusting. And that's my quarantine. That's what life is like right now. But honestly, I'm excited to be back home. And so it's kind of cool just to be in your own space once again. But yeah, New York has it rough. So you guys, one of the things you just missed is the 7 p.m. cheer. And that's this moment where everybody leans outside their windows and we all just start going crazy, clapping and shaking tambourines and stuff for the healthcare workers. And it's such a cool moment. I wish you could actually be here to see it, because it's I don't know, it's just it gives life. And it just shows when there's solidarity and when there's transcendence, something wakes up in you. You get goosebumps, your heart beats faster, and it's that's just a reminder that we were built for that. So let's segue into Mere Christianity, where C.S. Lewis talks about transcendence and why we're built for that. And so I wanted to ask you this question just to start off, and the question is this. Why do you think C.S. broke this book into 4 sections? Because you could just go chapter by chapter. And I think the answer is there are 4 hurdles that you have to kind of get over. in identifying with the Christian faith, believing the Christian faith. There's 4 hurdles that you have to get over. So that hurdle number 1 is just the idea, does God exist? And I think that still, all the time, like you'll bump into certain things in life where you're just like, sometimes I'll walk down West River Drive and I'll just look up and like the sky seems so big. I don't know how else to describe it, but the sky seems so big. And so it's like, is there really God in all of this? Or is it just like, is nature just nature? And are we alone in the universe? And is everything cold and whatever? And so there's like that question that you have. And so C.S. Lewis deals with that question. He goes, I think the best proof that there's the existence of God is the existence of morality. The idea that we think that we should be better than we are. That shouldn't exist in the natural world. And we don't even see it anywhere else. A tree doesn't think, why am I doing this? Should I be different? Should I be another tree? Killer whales aren't swimming around thinking, there's got to be more to life than this. But we humans believe that there is something more, and we just haven't grasped it. And that's the first clue that we were built for something like transcendence. The second hurdle is, okay, say we are built for transcendence. Now we have God. Okay, well, which God? There's 5 major religions. How do we choose the right one? Which one is more right? There's prophets, and they've said all kinds of great things. There's philosophers. They've said all kinds of great things. How do we pick? And so we delve into that lane, and we start to see C.S. Lewis breaks down the person of Jesus Christ as a representation of Christianity, and why that is such a, why he is a picture of something that's unique and different than any of the religions of the world offer. So if those 2 things are true, the next hurdle is, all right, I intellectually believe these things, what happens next? And he goes into a section called Christian behavior. Now, that's a weird name because nobody likes behavior. It's like the last thing anybody wants to do is behave. But the idea is, if you believe something, you act on it. And so, like, because I believe that gravity is true, I don't run off the top of my building and jump out the window. I know that I'll fall. And so if you believe that God is real, that transcendence exists, and that Jesus Christ represented something that is wrapped up in the idea of Christianity, you will actually act on that belief in a certain way. There are repercussions to the things that we believe intellectually. So that bleeds from the intellectual into the practical, and the practical is book 3. Now, book 4 is theology. And the reason is, and I think this is the last hurdle we're tackling, if you can't understand what God is like, you'll actually never be in relationship. So it's a good question to ask yourself. What do you truly believe that God is like? Is he happy? Is he happy to know you, to see you? Is he cold and distant? Is he a person, the man upstairs with a lightning bolt? Is he around? Is he not really angry or not care? What does that mean? What is God actually like? And all of that is wrapped around the question that theology is the answer to. And so the last hurdle we jump over in this section 4, book 4 of Mere Christianity, is this question of theology. Now, he brings up that some people will say, this isn't very important, we don't need to address theology. And I think that we do. And here's why. I think he just puts it like absolutely perfectly. He says, theology is practical, especially now. This is so important. In the old days, when there was less education and discussion, perhaps it was possible to get on with very few simple ideas about God. But it's not so now. Everyone reads, everyone hears things discussed. Consequently, if you do not listen to theology, that will not mean that you have no ideas about God. It will mean that you have a lot of wrong ideas, bad, muddled, out-of-date ideas. For a great many of the ideas about God, which are trotted out as novelties today, are simply the ones which real theologians tried centuries ago and rejected. To believe in the popular religion of modern England is retrogression, like believing the earth is flat. I love that idea, like believing the earth is flat. There are some things that people believe now and some ideas that are touted out as new theology, but they're actually just really old theology. I think Malcolm Muggeridge said, new news is old news happening to new people. And the reality is, because we're not really students of history, we haven't seen all the iterations that things have gone through. So something comes up now and seems like, yeah, maybe this new way of just like a watered down Christianity where there's no such ideas, where there's no ideas of atonement, or there's no idea of a wrathful God, or there's no ideas of, X, Y, and Z. That's something new. And it's not. It's been around for centuries and centuries, and theologians have dealt with it and asked the hard questions and have developed new ideas around it. But all of that has been vetted. And so what C.S. is going to talk about in the next couple chapters is the idea of theology, understanding who God is and what Christians have agreed on for 2,000 years so that you can enter into right relationship with him. With that said, I want to basically go through the next couple of chapters by going through pictures that C.S. paints. The reason I want to use pictures is because A, these chapters on theology can get a little boring, and they can kind of like go over at least my head, or glaze your eyes over. And so the pictures that C.S. paints with words are actually the most important part of understanding where he's going. So I have a couple pictures. One is statues. The other is a man on his knees in prayer. Another is a baby saying its first words. The last one is perfect teeth, and then I'll do a little closing so we can kind of like tie a bow and all this. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is statues. And here's why. Because on this journey, C.S. is going to set us up in this first chapter. It's called making and begetting, two words we don't really use anymore. But I will, but let's at least get started, and then we'll kind of see where that goes. I'm on 117, page 117, the last paragraph at the bottom. He says, we don't use words begetting or begotten much in modern English, but everyone still knows what they mean. To beget is to become the father of. To create is to make. And the difference is this. When you beget something of the same kind as yourself. A man begets human babies, a beaver begets little beavers, and a bird begets eggs which turn into little birds. But when you make something of a different kind than yourself. A bird makes a nest, a beaver builds a dam, a man makes a wireless set. Here's the important part. Or he may make something more like himself than a wireless set, say a statue. If he is a clever enough carver, he may make a statue which is very like a man indeed. But of course, it's not a real man. It only looks like one. It cannot breathe or think. It's not alive. He begins this whole section by basically setting up these two different modes of being. So he actually uses Greek words to describe them because we in English have one like gross limitation, and that's that we only have one way to describe life. In the Greek, they had multiple ways, and so one of those words to describe life was bios. And bios makes a lot of sense, like where biology would come from. It's the physical makeup of us. But the other is zoe, and that's more spiritual, the transcendent makeup of life. And so when Jesus talks and he says, I have come that you may have life and life more abundantly, he doesn't use the Greek word bios, he used the Greek word zoe. I have come that you may have transcendent life and transcendent life more abundantly. And the very first thing that we kind of need to address as we move through these chapters is this idea that there are actually two kinds of life available to us. The first is bios, the natural life. The second is zoe, the spiritual. And the word picture that he paints for that, the metaphor he kind of puts together, is the idea of statues. Statues don't have life, but they look a lot like us. And in the same way, we were made in God's image. And at the same time, we are not begotten by God. That's something offered to us through Jesus Christ. So all of the Christian walk is going to be this movement from the bios, only the bios, to zoe as well. And so it's this progression towards the spiritually transcendent. That's what he wants to paint in the beginning. If you're familiar with C.S. Lewis, you know that his fiction he always builds these ideas into his fiction. So I don't know if you'll notice this, but if you've ever watched Chronicles of Narnia, you know that the White Witch turns people into stones, into statue. And so these statues then are all collected in her castle, and so they remain there. When Aslan comes and eventually sets like the whole place free, one of the places he goes to is the witch's castle, and he blows onto the statues and they come back to life. And that's C.S. Lewis' picture of what has happened to humanity. In the beginning, in the garden, we had bios and zoe together. As time progressed, with the fall, we only get bios, and we have to work towards, because of redemption, we then work ourselves towards zoe once again. And that picture that he's painting is whatever was lost that turned us into statues, Christ, Aslan, has made new. And so when he breathes on the redemption, we then turn back into what we were always intended to be, bios and zoe, the natural life and the spiritual life perfectly entwined. He starts us there because the idea is where we're going is going to require you to understand that the natural life is not all that you're called to. There's a transcendent life. There's a spiritual life that we're called to, and that's where we're headed. So, with that said, he next talks about the Trinity. This is an interesting jump. A lot of people are not super into the idea of a Trinity, and it's hard to understand, and people come up with different pictures for how to understand the Trinity and all of that. I don't want to get wrapped up in pictures. I think that there's a bunch of ways to explain the Trinity. Some of them are tough, some of them are tougher, and it's just really hard in our limited understanding to really wrap your head around an idea that one person can be three people. So take it or leave it. I just think that's a difficult thing. And if that's difficult, let it be difficult, but let's just suspend disbelief for a second and just try and wrap our heads around this idea that, okay, God exists in three personalities. Now, here's what's interesting about that. Because God has basically shown himself to us to be a triune God, three persons in one, that's why God can make the claim that God is love. I don't know if you've thought about this before, but it's such an interesting idea that like God is love. Not that God is loving, or not that if there's love, it's because of God. No, that God is actually love itself. The only way that would be possible is if there were multiple facets, that like multiple personalities within God that could all actually love each other. One thing could actually be love if there were three things in it that were loving each other. And so that's why the Trinity is a pretty amazing, profound, and unique thing to the Christian faith, because it makes God not just loving, but love itself. And so why C.S. Lewis goes here next after the whole making and begetting thing is because if you're moving towards Zoe, what are you actually moving towards? How do we like define spiritual life? And he says the best way to define it is to look at the Trinity. Look at this love relationship that God seems to have with himself. You're actually brought into that. You think about God the Father and God the Son. And then you, in John 1, are called sons of God if you believe. So now there's a Father and there's a Son, and now you enter into the triune life with God as well. You're living in the midst of Trinity. And so I just think that's like a super profound idea because this is all kind of like captured in the picture of a man on his knees praying. I'll read you, I think that it's on page 163. Listen to this in page 163 and imagine yourself here. An ordinary Christian kneels down to say his prayers. He's trying to get in touch with God, but if he's a Christian, he knows that what is prompting him to pray is also God, so to speak, inside of him. But he also knows that all his real knowledge of God comes through Christ, the man who was God, that Christ is standing beside him, helping him to pray, praying for him. You see what's happening? God is the thing to which he is praying, the goal he's trying to reach. God is also the thing inside of him, which is pushing him on. Hold on.
Hey, how are you doing?
Good.
Check out that light. Okay,
Yeah.
I could use your help.
Okay.
Do you have a moment?
I don't. I will in 45 minutes.
Okay.
I have to record this like class thing, basically.
Good. It looks really wonderful. Here you go.
So do you want to just knock up for me in like 45 minutes?
Yeah, I'll find you. I'll come back down.
Yep. Yeah, 45 minutes I'll definitely be done, so just find me. Okay. And that was my neighbor. What I mean is this. An ordinary, simple Christian kneels down to say his prayers. He's trying to get in touch with God. But if he's a Christian, he knows that what is prompting him to pray is also God, so to speak, inside of him. But he also knows that all his real knowledge of God comes through Christ, the man who was God, that Christ is standing beside him, helping him to pray, praying for him. You see what's happening? God is the thing to which he's praying, the goal he's trying to reach. God's also the thing inside of him which is pushing him on, the motive power. God is also the road or bridge along which he is being pushed towards that goal. So the whole threefold life of the three-personal being is actually going on in that ordinary life, in that ordinary little bedroom where an ordinary man is saying his prayers. The man is being caught up in the higher kind of life, what I call Zoe, or spiritual life. He's being pulled into God, by God, while still remaining himself. So this is just like profound and cool. And the reason is because I think like this picture of prayer is the perfect way to encapsulate what the Zoe life is in entering into a triune relationship with God. Picture yourself in prayer. I don't know how you pray. I'm not really on my knees when I pray. But, you know, picture me on that chair right there with a journal in my hand, and it's the morning, and what's happening? What's actually happening? I mean, in one sense, from a worldly perspective, nothing's happening. I'm mumbling up to the sky. But in some very profound spiritual sense, we as Christians know and believe that what's really happening is that the Holy Spirit is inside of me, moving on me in all kinds of ways, prompting certain thoughts. Things are rising up in me. God in me is prompting something. At the same time, Jesus alongside of me. Jesus, who is basically the representation of what I know God is like. Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Everything we know about God comes from what we know about Jesus. And Jesus has stood in the gap, and he basically is, when God sees us, he sees Jesus. And so Jesus beside me, and then the Father in front of me. And so in that, like that's a picture that you can actually apply to your own prayer life. Like actually truly sit down and think, Jesus in this room, Jesus beside me, Holy Spirit inside me, God in front of me. And in that process, we start to grasp a little what is meant by the triune relationship. This is important. I mean, it might sound crazy. It might literally sound crazy. But it's important because if you want to love somebody, you actually, that idea, do you love God? That's such a deep, complex idea. But it's an important question that I think we need to answer. And one of the ways that we can answer it is by getting into something, by understanding more of what it actually looks like relationally. You can't love somebody that you don't know. And you can't know God if you just call God an abstraction, some guy up there or some force that kind of is around. But if you actually take God for who he says he is in the Bible, you enter into the three personalities of God. And those three personalities are intertwined in whatever Zoe life looks like. That's why C.S. Lewis moves to the Trinity next, instead of jumping to a bunch of other things. So we have bios life, we enter into Zoe. The Christian life is entering into the spirituality. One of the ways that we embrace that Zoe life is by entering into that triune relationship with God. God in me, God beside me, God in front of me. Now, here's what's cool. He moves next into the idea of what are we praying. And this is in the chapter. I'm going to skip a couple chapters because I don't think they're super relevant to what we need to talk about in the time that we have. So I'm going to jump right to chapter 7, Let's Pretend. Now the picture I'm giving you for this is a baby, but we're going to get to a baby at the end of it. In the beginning, I want to talk about pretending and the way that it relates to prayer. Think about this. At the very beginning of chapter 7, may I once again start by putting two pictures, or two stories rather, in your mind. I'm only going to read one of them. One is the story you have all read called Beauty and the Beast. The girl, you remember, had to marry a monster for some reason, and she did. She kissed it as if it were a man, and then much to her relief, it really turned into a man, and all went well. And then he relays another one, and then I'm going to kind of keep moving, and it says, you see, what had begun as a disguise had become reality. I think both of these stories help to illustrate what I have to say in this chapter. Up until now, I've been trying to describe facts, what God is and what he has done. Now I want to talk about practice, what to do next. What difference does all this theology make? It can start making a difference tonight. If you are interested enough to have read thus far, you're probably interested enough to make a shot at saying your prayers. And whatever else you say, you will probably say the Lord's Prayer. Its very first words are, Our Father. Do you now see what those words mean? They mean, quite frankly, that you are putting yourself in the place as a son of God. To put it bluntly, you're dressing up as Christ. This is unbelievably profound. I actually, until I had read Mere Christianity, I never thought of the Our Father this way. Because I think in our culture, there's just an underlying idea. It's like we've heard it so much, we don't even know what it means anymore. So the underlying idea is, of course, I'm a son of God. I'm, made in God's image. That's not what Christianity is talking about. You're made in God's image, but you are not a son of God. That's something that you get through Christ. And so this idea that if you are a Christian, if you put a stake in the ground, you say, this is what I believe, the very first steps of that are actually hard to overcome. What does it actually mean to be a son of God? So C.S. Lewis's encouragement in this chapter, he calls the chapter, Let's Pretend. And the reason he does is because it's like there's some pretending, quote unquote, that you have to move into before you can actually enter into what you're called to enter into. We know this idea in the world, it's fake it till you make it. And there is some element of truth that's embedded into that. You actually have to dress for the job you want, not the job you have. And a lot of things in life, we see that if you start to pretend, then you'll move in the direction of what you're trying to be. I think Kurt Vonnegut said, be careful who you pretend to be, because you are who you pretend to be. And the reality is, we're trying to be all kinds of things. Kids are trying to be adults, and so that's why eventually they become them, And the picture that Lewis gives at the end, if you think that this is weird, I think that he actually summarizes this perfectly and proves his point perfectly on page 193 at the very end of this chapter. Here's what he says. God looks at you as if you were a little Christ. Christ stands beside you to turn you into one. I dare say this idea of divine make-believe sounds rather strange at first, but is it really so strange? Is it not how the higher thing always raises the lower? listen to this. A mother teaches her baby to talk by talking to it as if it's understood her long before it really does. We treat our dogs as if they were, quote, almost human. That's why they really become almost human in the end. And so he gives this picture of a mother and her child. And you know, in the very beginning, the mom's holding that baby and just saying, oh, you're the cutest thing I've ever seen. Aren't you the cutest thing? And the baby just sits there and it's like, this is what it sounds like the baby. Wah, 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 wah. It literally can't comprehend a single thing that she's saying. But do you notice that as she continues saying that, the words start to make sense? And so in a weird way, there's a pretending going on in the beginning. We're trying to pretend that we actually can communicate, that there's language going on here. And then through the act of pretending, somehow it actually becomes true. And so it is with us. In this Christian life, there's going to be that beginning stage of things. To enter into the Zoe life is not natural, and we don't even know exactly how to do it. And so what happens in the beginning is we get down on our knees and we say things like, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Do I believe that God is truly my Father the way that I believe that my Father is? Maybe not. But through time, that gradual progression, I start to believe more and more until it actually starts to become true. There's an element of growth, the higher to the lower, there's an element of growth that we're on track for, but we have to start pretending first. Now, one little caveat, is it really pretending? C.S. Lewis is calling it that, just to make it like a little fun and playful. But the truth is, it's trying. There's an element of there's an effort that we're putting into things. Dallas Willard says God's not opposed to effort, he's opposed to earning. There's an element of our faith that we're actually attempting to move in a direction. And there's a God, and God's part is that he honors that. And so those two things are mixed together. So that's the idea, that's the picture of the baby. If you remember the pictures, I'm just going to keep them in your mind. So it's just what is book 4 of Mere Christianity? Picture 1, statues. Statues that are going to come to life. Bios that's going to go into Zoe. Number 2, a man on his knees. And what is the man on his knees doing? God is in him, moving on him to say certain things. God is beside him, Jesus, praying to the Father who's in front of him. The picture of a man on his knees. And then how do we actually go about this process? Just like a baby. Just sit there on its mother's lap and hear wah, 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 wah. And eventually it turns into, oh my gosh, you're the cutest thing I've ever seen. And not only that, but you can speak it back. All right, last picture. And this is found in, I think, page 207. This is basically, I know there's going to be people out there who say, fake it. How could you fake it? I mean, if Christianity is true, that's the one thing that you absolutely shouldn't fake. It needs to be authentic. And I see people faking it all the time. But the reality is, I guess I just want to address that question. There's a bunch of what we would call fakes or phonies in Christianity. And I mean, I get it. I watch TV and I kind of I see people in my everyday life and I'm just man, I don't know. Do we really believe all the same stuff? And is this person faking it and is it bad that they actually are? It's a different thing, I think, than C.S. is talking about. But in that thought, there's a really, really profound idea that we need to address in terms of, there's a dangerous idea in that thought. And it's the idea of comparison as a way to gauge where you are in your own spiritual life. So he has a chapter 10, the next chapter says, nice people or new men. Nice people or new men. And he says this is on page 207. I think it's the right moment to consider a question which is often asked. If Christianity is true, why are not all Christians obviously nicer than all non-Christians? All right, so I've got a friend, Matt. We grew up together in high school. He actually goes to Calvary. And I would say from the get-go, Matt, as the little kid, was basically one of the nicest people I know. Not only was he nice, he cared about people and he was just generally nice, he pretty much would always do the right thing. Person of character, not a guy who would lie, cheat, steal, whatever. And in high school, when I was getting into all kinds of different stuff, Matt really wasn't. He was playing music and in a band. And I wouldn't say that Matt had some deep spiritual relationship with God. I think most of his niceness was basically built on just who he was. A little bit of his temperament, a little bit of his nature, and a little bit of his nurture. And I remember I used to kind of think, later in life, Matt, started coming to church and got involved and everything. And it's has had all kinds of transformations in his own life. But I remember thinking when he first came around, I was Matt's kind of always been better than me. And I was raised in a Christian home and I believe all this stuff. So is it actually true that God's done something in my life because Matt is better than me? And that's a small question there. And then the bigger question is like, okay, like there's Christians and there's people like Gandhi. What do you do about Gandhi? Is Gandhi in heaven? You know, you hear that kind of stuff all the time. And so there's this idea, did God come to basically make nice men or new people? And if he did, why aren't the new people much nicer than they were before? And so he addresses that because it's a big question. And the question all revolves around comparison. Starts off with that. And I think like the way that the picture that I give you for this chapter, like if you're going to remember how to just encapsulate this idea, the picture I give you is toothpaste or a smile. Because he gives an illustration of toothpaste in here that I think is spot on in terms of how we compare with others. This is on 209 at the bottom. He says, suppose we have come down to brass tacks and are now talking about not an imaginary Christian and an imaginary non-Christian, but two real people in our own neighborhood. Even then, we must be careful to ask the right question. If Christianity is true, then it ought to follow that A, any Christian will be nicer than the same person would be if they were not a Christian, and B, that any man who becomes a Christian will become nicer than he was before. Just in the same way, if the advertisement for White Smiles toothpaste are true, it ought to follow that A, anyone who uses it will have better teeth than the same person would have if they didn't use it, and B, that if anyone begins to use it, his teeth will improve. But to point out that I, who use White Smiles, and also have inherited bad teeth from both my parents, have not got as fine a set as a healthy young man who never used any toothpaste at all, does not by itself prove that the advertisements are untrue. Christian Miss Bates may have an unkinder tongue than unbelieving Dick Firkin. That by itself does not tell us whether Christianity works. The question, this is important, is what Miss Bates' tongue would be like if she were not a Christian, and what Dick's would be like if he became one. So in the illustration of the toothpaste, what he's doing is he's saying, okay, there's the idea of like this toothpaste, and you've seen this advertisement, makes you 5 shades whiter. But the question isn't necessarily where are you getting to as much as where did you start, right? So some supermodel on Instagram may have the whitest teeth that I've ever seen, and I don't compare to that. And so if my teeth get 5 shades whiter, they just might end up where she already is. But if she used it too, her teeth may get 5 shades whiter than that. And so our comparisons don't work because the fundamental idea is that our nature and our nurture and our temperaments are very different. And Christ's redemption works itself out differently based on where we're starting from. So I went to counseling a couple years ago. And in counseling, you always end up talking about your parents, right? Because our parents are always what ruined us or, made us who we are. So I remember talking about my parents and, I was basically saying like, yeah, I think like my mom's like this, my dad's like this, X, Y, Z. And he gave me an illustration that I thought was really important. He said, it's important to understand where your parents started. Like, take a football field. Where did they start? Were they on the 30-yard line? My mom's dad died when she was 16, and my dad comes from, my dad's parents were divorced when he was 2, and he had a little bit of a dysfunctional childhood, and so they had a different experience than I did. So where did they get? And so, like, let's say they started on like the 20-yard line, and let's say I started on like the 50. Well, if I go 30 yards, and if they go 50 yards, they technically went further than me, but they still look like they're behind me. I mean, they would hope that I would go further than them. That's the hope that every parent has for a child. But the idea is that if we look at things by comparison, we don't deal with the reality of nature and nurture and how they affect our lives, because we'll just look at the end result. But God's supernatural glasses, he sees the world in a totally different way. This is why sometimes I'll walk around, sometimes I go to like, rough parts of the city or something like that. And I'll walk around and I'll look at like some houses and they're like dilapidated and broken down. And I just kind of look around and I'm like, you know what? Like somewhere in here, there's like a mother praying for her son. Somewhere in here, there's a person who's believing with expectancy and faith that like that God's going to pull through for them in some way. Somewhere here, there's a person who's taking the first baby steps and really trusting God in some element. And then you can pull into the richest neighborhood in America, and those people aren't present there. The people there may be trusting themselves for everything. They might be consumed by greed. They might be, just play the stereotype out. And I always wonder what it actually looks like to God's eyes. Because from the outside, I see dilapidated houses and $1 million houses. But what does God see? Because God actually looks at the heart. And maybe our $1 million neighborhoods actually look like the ghetto to God. And maybe some of the roughest places in the city, because there's amazing believing people there who are trusting God, it looks like millionaire houses to him. And that's the thing, I think, that's the reason why CS is saying you can't get into the ideas of comparison. You can't say, well, this person behaves like this and this person behaves like this, so Christianity is not true, because they both are about as nice as each other. The question is, where did they come from and where are they going? And so the reason why he brings up Mrs. Bates and Dick Firkin is Mrs. Bates may be, just that lady who, like, she really just always tells it as it is, and it's almost kind of annoying, And Dick Firkin's this nice guy who, like, always says the right thing. Is that because they're believers? No, it's the temperaments and the nature and the nurture they were given. But the question is, who would Miss Bates be without Christ, and who would Dick be with Christ? And whatever we're given, if you've been given an excellent nature and nurture and temperament, there's much required, and God wants you to be walking on that journey towards whatever he intended you to be. And that may look absolutely amazing. But somebody that you look at who may look like they're 10 years behind you may have overcome all kinds of adversity, and they may be doing amazing in their walk with God because they weren't given the best cards to begin with. So C.S. Lewis is basically saying in this chapter, listen, on our path of pretending, as we grow to be more like God, as we start this process, don't look around you to gauge whether you're okay or whether somebody's truly a Christian or not a Christian. The question is, what has God given you, yourself? And are you walking fully in that? No comparison. And I think he kind of pulls this together perfectly. If you have your book, turn to 2:16. 2:16 says this. Nice people are new men. A world of nice people, content in their own niceness, looking no further, turned away from God, would be just as desperately in need of salvation as a miserable world, and might even be more difficult to save. For mere improvement is not redemption, though redemption always improves people even here and now, and will, in the end, improve them to a degree we cannot yet imagine. God became man to turn creatures into sons, not simply to produce better men of the old kind, but to produce a new kind of man. It is not like teaching a horse, I love this illustration, it's not like teaching a horse to jump better and better, but like turning a horse into a winged creature. Of course, once it's got wings, it soars over the fences, which could have never been jumped, and thus beat the natural horse at its own game. But there might be a period while the wings are just beginning to grow, when it cannot do so. And at that stage, the lumps on the shoulders, no one could tell by looking at them they're going to be wings, may even give it an awkward appearance. So I just want to encourage some of you who might struggle with this idea that it's like, man, there are some things in my life that just haven't changed. And is that actually a sign that I don't really believe what I say I believe? God's got grace for that. And I sincerely mean that because there is a journey towards the Zoe life as you walk from your bios to Zoe, where you are actually working against your nature and your nurture to something totally new and profound that God has for you. That journey is more difficult for some people than it is for others. There are just people who were born where a lot was stacked against them. And so God has grace for that and accounts for all those types of things. If you feel like it's like, gosh, I can't seem to get my words right. I always end up moving towards the critical and putting people down, and I just can't get that figured out. If you're someone who's like, I can't get lustful thoughts out of my head, I can't get that solved. If you're somebody who's like, I just have anger and bitterness towards the way I was raised or like people that hurt me or whatever, and I can't get that figured out. The truest part of it is like those aren't signs that God's redemptive work isn't true in you. It's signs that there are things to beat, and God wants to be part of that. So there's a quote, I think Joe Focht is the one I hear it from the most, and he says, dead men don't wrestle. And the point is basically just, are you wrestling? Are you wrestling your way towards that journey, or is it something you're leaving and letting go of? And wrestling is the truest sign of life. And so it's not that somebody is better than you, that somebody's got it together more than you, that somebody's nicer than you. It's where you've come from and where God is taking you. We're not trying to be nice people. We're trying to be new people. And God's transformative act will definitely beat those old things. It may take time, but in the end, you won't even look like the person that you were before. Last chapter, the last chapter in Mere Christianity. Congratulations. This is like the finish line where you like lean out. This chapter is called New Men. And we talked mostly about the idea of new men. So let me just say it this way. I'll just read you the end of the book, because I think, what am I going to say that C.S. Lewis didn't say better? He says this is on 226. At the beginning I said there were personalities in God. That's the Trinity. I'll go further now. There are no real personalities anywhere else. Until you have given up yourself to Him, you will not have a real self. Sameness is to be found most among the natural men, not among those who surrender to Christ. How monotonously alike are all the great tyrants and conquerors. How gloriously different are all the saints. But there must be a real giving up of the self. You must throw it away blindly, so to speak. Christ will indeed give you a real personality, but you must not go to Him for the sake of that. As long as your own personality is what you are bothering about, you are not going to Him at all. The very first step is to try to forget about yourself altogether. Your real new self, which is Christ and also yours, and yours just because it is His, will not come as long as you are looking for it. It will come when you're looking for Him. Does that sound strange? The same principle holds, for more everyday matters. I love this. Even in social life, you will never make a good impression on other people until you stop thinking about what sort of impression you're making on them. Even in literature and art, no man who bothers about originality will ever be original. Whereas if you simply try to tell the truth without caring twopence how often it's been told before, you will 9 times out of 10 become original without even having noticed it. The principle runs through all life from top to bottom. Give up yourself and you will find your real self. Lose your life and you will save it. Submit to death, death of your ambitions and favorite wishes every day, and death of your whole body in the end. Submit with every fiber of your being and you will find eternal life. Keep back nothing. Nothing that you have not given away will really be yours. Nothing in you that has not died will ever be raised from the dead. Look for yourself, and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find Him, and with Him, everything else thrown in. In the very beginning of the book, he walks through a very intellectual idea. Does God exist? Religion is a little bit of an intellectual idea too, section 2. The third, behavior, is very practical. And I think the weird thing about those is, disconnected from this truth, none of those things matter. I've been to debates where people will debate all day about whether God is real and exists. And I've gotten this funny feeling in them where I'm like, I don't even know that this person really believes what they're saying as much as just trying to prove themselves right in a debate. Or if you move your way towards like behavior, I've had these moments where I'm like, man, behavior seems to be like just a formula that people follow to make themselves feel a little bit better, to maybe put themselves into alignment with God. But neither that intellect or that behavior is actually relational life with God. This is relational life with God. And I've always tried to somehow tell people the story of God, at least the way it makes sense to me, in like a new and fresh way. Because I mean, come on, like everybody, you could be like, hey, Jesus died for your sins. And people are like, yeah, that's part of like Seinfeld's stand-up at this point. Like, no one wants to hear that, Or you got to be born again, and people are like, born again, that was like a thing in the 70s. The world's like moved past the way that we've told the story so far. And so there's almost like a reframing that sometimes maybe is needed. And so I've been wondering for most of my life, how do I actually talk to someone? And so I have like my trial and error when I talk to people about God. Like, there's all kinds of ways that I've approached it, but I have settled a little bit on this. And it's this idea that in the beginning, life with God started in a garden, in the beginning of the Bible. And then at the end of the Bible, it ends in a city. In both of those places, God dwells with man. It says in the beginning that God walked with Adam in the cool of the day. And the very end of Revelation says, now the tabernacle of God is with man. And so those are the two bookends of the Bible. And so you have this idea that in the beginning, God was with us as a friend, as a father, as all of those things. And the goal, as the story through all the ups and downs that we've traveled to, that very last punchline at the end is now the dwelling place of God. The tabernacle means dwelling place. The tabernacle of God is once again with men. And so what finally sets the story right is whatever was broken in the beginning was the lack of relationship. Whatever's restored in the end is relationship again. So the story of God is basically our ups and downs on the journey and God's insertion into our story to bring us back into relationship with Him. There's when I went to Israel when I was, in 2011, I think. I remember there's like an imitation tabernacle. Some of you guys who are going to Israel, you'll be able to see this and walk around. Hopefully in September, I got my fingers crossed for you. There's an imitation tabernacle. Somebody built a full-size tabernacle. You remember the tabernacle that used to travel around with the Jews in the desert? There's a full-size tabernacle in this kind of like desert spot in Israel. And when you go, there's this little woman. I hope she's still there. She's amazing. She's a Messianic Jew. She's probably 4'6", and she's just super like, I don't know. She's just got like a great voice, and she just, I don't know. She carries herself amazing, like a cartoon character. And she's out at the front, and she basically says, "Now let's go. Let's walk into the tabernacle." And she turns around and she starts walking in, and you walk through the entrance. And this is life size. So you can see, I mean, it's like as big as like 5 or 6 houses. And so you walk into the outer courts. And as you're walking into the entrance, she stops and she turns around and she says, "Now, I just want to remind you that the way the tabernacle was set up is it's set up so the entrance always faced the sun, where the sun would rise. And so the reason was because all the cultures in those days, they worshipped the sun as their god. And so for you to enter into the tabernacle, you had to put your back to the sun and walk towards this God. So you had to put your back towards all the other things that every other culture worships, and you had to embrace this God as your God." So already I'm like, oh my gosh, where are we? I had no idea that all of this is as true and profound as I could possibly imagine. So you walk in, and then she talks about the brazen altar, the outer courts, and there's like metaphor after metaphor after metaphor, and all these layers to everything in there. Everything pointed to Christ and was representative. So we're in the tabernacle itself, and you'll remember that there's a place in the tabernacle that no one could go into. It's where the Ark of the Covenant was, and it was the Holy of Holies. Eventually, over time, the tabernacle is, the tabernacle's lost, and they build the temple. But the Ark of the Covenant is lost as well. And so there's no Ark of the Covenant, but they still have the Holy of Holies in the temple. And there's a veil that was put in front of the Holy Holies. From the very beginning, it was in the tabernacle. And the veil had 2 cherubim on it. And the reason is because when, in the fall, when Adam and Eve sinned, you can read in Genesis that God basically barred entrance to the garden to like to perfection. Like, the place where God's Spirit dwelled, you couldn't have access to it. He says He put 2 cherubim with flaming swords. And so if you could see the tabernacle back then, or if you had walked into the temple in Jerusalem in those times, you would see the Holy of Holies, and there would be a big curtain and 2 cherubim with flaming swords crossed. You can't enter into this place. And so that's one of the profound things when you read the crucifixion, and when you find that when Jesus lets out His last breath, there's an earthquake that shakes everything, and the veil gets torn from top to bottom, so not from the bottom. It's not man's idea to tear the veil, that it's God's idea to tear the veil. He tears that veil from top to bottom, and what is He tearing? He's tearing the swords crossed by the 2 cherubim. And when that veil drops, those 2 cherubim drop with it, and those swords are uncrossed. And the idea is, the picture being painted is, now relationship with God is accessible once again. And that's the beginning of Zoe life. And so this narrative that we've walked through, where it's like it began in Genesis, and then things were kind of like rent asunder, and cherubim guard the relational life with God. Jesus comes and breaks that. The veil is torn, and now we can move in that direction once again. The Gospels tell us this story, and then the epistles tell us like a little bit more of how to live. But that revelation, the idea that God is coming back, in Revelation, that very bookend moment is now the tabernacle of God, the dwelling place of God, is once again with men. That is what the whole story of all of this is about. The reason I want to stress this so much is you can't miss that the intellectual matters and is important, but it's not the goal. The behavior matters and is important, but it's not the goal. This relational life, living life every day with God, is what is valuable. And that's why this closing section of Mere Christianity is all about who God is and how to enter into life with him, because that is the point of it all. So, with that said, I promised in the very beginning that I would read a letter. And this is my thank you letter to you for taking the class. And yeah, I think the best thing I can do is just read it to you. And then once I do read it, I'm just going to go offline. Before I do, let me just give a little plug for if you're really digging Wednesday nights at 7 p.m. and you're like, hey, we're keeping this slot open, Calvary will be filling it with some other stuff. So next week, next Wednesday at 7 p.m., there's going to be a prayer gathering, like an online prayer gathering. It's going to be really cool, like a different format than I think we've done as a church, and I think you'll really like it. So if you're used to this time slot and you want to keep it open, 7 p.m. next week, we're going to be doing something really cool and really different, so I hope you tune in. Now, let me send you out with this letter. I write thank you letters all the time for like people for all kinds of things. It just kind of keeps me grounded and like, you know, blesses people and then also reminds them how much they mean to me. And so when I wrote a letter to a couple people, but I also want to write a letter to you guys to remind you how much you mean to me. So I said, Mere X class. I do that for Christianity. Mere Christianity class. First, I want to thank you for your time. I'm always humbled by this idea of 100 people listening to one person, even if it's just for an hour per week. It will never not feel strange. But I know many of you personally, and many of you are wiser and more mature than me. Over the years, I've stolen a lot of wisdom and life learnings from each of you. So maybe this is just a small way of returning the favor. Talking about God is an impossible task. My sister calls books in this category Christian explainers. And by that she means a book that takes something as big and intangible of an idea as faith and reduces it to something simple, like a framework or a formula. I think I share her sentiment that we don't really need another Christian explainer book. These days there are too many ideas about God and not enough experiences. Let me tell you my favorite excerpt in this entire book. It's actually a little offhand remark C.S. makes somewhere near the end when he talks about theology. He says, theology is an experimental science. I resonate because most of the richness in my spiritual life has come from experimenting with faith, whereas very little has come from my ideas that I've learned along the way. If there's one thing I'd love to dismantle in the church today, it's this idea of formulas. I remember Tim Keller doing a sermon on giving, and he said, I'm not going to tell you how I go about giving in my own personal life. If I did, it would rob you of your own giving journey with God. I love that. You can hear 1,000 sermons on giving, but nothing will teach you the sacrifice and joy of giving more than giving itself will. Life with God is the experimental science, and we learn by experimenting. So, I hope this book has blessed you and given you all kinds of inspiration. But even more, I hope that you've begun to identify the specific area in your life where you can try something new. Experiment, fall down, let God pick you back up. If you live like that, and I mean this with no offense to C.S. Lewis, the story of your life will be 100 times better than Mere Christianity was ever intended to be. As a class, we've enjoyed our Would You Rathers, so I'll leave you with this last one to close. Would you rather read about faith or live it? The best answer is both, of course, but if you had to choose one, I hope you choose to live it. And I mean the John 10 Zoe kind of live it. Here's to life more abundantly. Bless you all.